Hello, everybody, and welcome to another lecture. Hope everyone's doing well, handling everything. So, today we're going to talk about an extremely relevant issue right now with social movements. You've been following the news, you know about recent events, and we're not going to go into much detail about the current events and stuff like that, but we're going to talk about social movements from an administrative perspective instead. And I think it was incredibly relevant because I was prepping this lecture the moment when the riots began, and I was beginning to prep this lecture, and just the timing of everything was very surreal and eerie. So we're going to start with social movements today in chapter 11, and we're almost through. So first thing we're going to talk about is collective behavior. If you've ever taken a sociology course or social theory course, you've probably heard of this idea before, but for those who haven't, I'm going to go into detail about what it is today. So, collective behavior. Social strain can lead to attempts to remedy the situations, and we know this by strain theory that tells you that when somebody's experiencing strain, they are more likely to commit deviant or social or criminal acts. So that would be, we know that already from our crim theory. But also, the idea of collective behavior, which refers to people who like to group together based on similar situations of strain, and they're motivated to explore solutions to that strain or that social problem. People group together. A good example, like I said, right now with everything that's going on right now, collective behavior is everybody's grouping together based on a similar pattern of strain. So that is what collective behavior in a nutshell means. We're also going to talk about social problems and then social problems theory. So Spector and, I'm probably going to butcher this name, but Kitzus in 1973, starts with K. Anyways, one of the first to define like social problems and social problems theory. So essentially, social problem theory refers to activities that are a group making claims to an organization's about a particular condition. So, and the claimant group in this part means the group that's having strain that is searching for a solution to their strain, and that would be the activities of a group that are trying to find solutions for their strain. That's what that would be. And you may also hear this titled as social constructionist process, and that's another name for it, in addition to social problems. So I'm going to refer to it hereafter as social problems, just because, or social constructionist, I meant. Yeah, I'm going to, hereafter it's going to be titled social constructionist process. So the social constructionist process has 4 different elements to it. And the first was that a group of people, how they decide, group of people decide that a situation or behavior is problematic. So any situation. So right now they're experiencing, let's just say, poverty, because I don't want to use current events at the moment. Say a big group of people are experiencing poverty, and they decide that this problem is problematic. So that would be step 1. And some of these other points that I have here as well. This problem, so the poverty in our example, must be experienced by multiple communities, not just one. So that means multiple like localities and areas are experiencing the same problem. Because if it's not, then it's only like a local problem, and it's not really going to be a big deal. It would be like, say, like the police brutality is only a problem in Minnesota when it's not, and we know that from research and everything else that it's a nationwide issue. So you must first make sure that the problem, in this case, is experienced in multiple communities and not just one of them. So they also must be perceived as an issue by the larger society. So, like, the more dominant people in the group must, in society, must see it as a problem as well. So, if we're going to go with our poverty example, they have to see it that poverty is a problem, and we know that to be the case. It's true. So, for the second part of this process, for the constructionist process, is that the claimant group, and remember we talked about what the claimant group is, which is the group who recognizes this problem and is trying to make a solution. So they're organizing together in order to solve this problem, and they're recognizing that there is a problem, and they begin to make this like organizational structure or hierarchy become an organization. This is an important step. So they're creating that organizational structure or hierarchy that we see in other organizations, where you have your leaders, you have your executives, you have kind of like the lay people at the bottom, and stuff like that, and outsiders and stuff like that. So the next one would be your social constructionist process for the third step, and that is like a perception that that group is the solutions that are created or the solutions that were offered to them didn't really solve the problem, or they did not produce that desired outcome. So government may have given them a solution, pay this much amount of money, give them welfare programs or something like that. But this group decides, okay, this is not really a good good enough solution to this problem. This official solution isn't good enough for us. So their confidence in like the official means, when I say official means here, declines. It means like the government socially acceptable means to solve this problem they don't want to approve. So they began to look for other solutions. So they decided if welfare is not going to help them, it's not a good enough help. So they distrust the government and say, nah, we're not going to take the welfare. That's not a good enough solution for us. So they're going to begin to look for other solutions that are, and these may be criminal, they may not be, who knows, but they look for other alternative means to solve this problem. So they're trying to solve poverty, and welfare does not help them. What are they going to do? So the last part of this process is, like I said, the group is going to reject that solution. So if the official solution is welfare, they're going to be like, nope, not happening. We're not going to take that, and move on. Try to look for a new solution. So that would be the last step of that framework. So we're actually going to talk about some of the critiques that social constructionist framework had. So the main issue with this social constructionist process that I've talked about so far is that there's not enough attention paid to how those groups of people organize themselves in that hierarchy to find a solution. So that's kind of a big issue with this critique. And because of this, it led to a 7-step framework, which was aimed to remedy the criticism. So the next 7-step framework was created in order to try to fix this criticism. So the next one we're going to talk about is the McAdam and Scott framework, which is 7 steps, which is a lot. And there's a table on page 195 of your text that does a good job of comparing the two frameworks, both the 7-step one that we're about to talk about as well as the constructionist one beforehand. So I would take a look at that page 195 so you can get a better idea of the two, because it's kind of comparing them in each stage. So you can look at that. And that's where I've pulled the wording for these elements. Ow! My cat just jumped on my back. Sorry about that. My cat decided he was gonna leap onto my back from my chair as I was trying to record this Life with a Kitten. So the 7-step, like I said, it's on page 7-step as well as the constructionist one are both on page 195. Now with this one, This one's a little bit more difficult to grasp. So I don't expect you to know the ins and outs of this particular one. We're going to walk through it, and at least you'll know the 7 steps. But further than that, and applying it and stuff like that, I'm not going to ask you to like apply it for your exam or anything. Just know the 7 steps and what it is. And that's good enough for me for this. Because this was a little bit challenging to understand and to put into better terms. So, first step of this process was that more powerful organizations are going to provide logistics to motivate each other to take action. So, this brings upon this idea of institutional actors, which are people who have the power to influence others but to take action. So they're going to motivate people to do it, to take action on some kind of solution. So that would be what an institutional actor is. That would be step 1. So step 2. This step is only completed after there is 3 levels present during your, for like an organizational hierarchy. You have to establish 3 levels within this. So overall, dominant and challenger organizations are established in the problem definition. So we know who dominates and we know who challenges them. So we have the dominants, and this is one of the 3. Dominants are organizations who control activities and discussion of that problem. Challengers are going to oppose the dominants, and they're going to want to change how the problem is defined. So they're going to oppose the dominants. And then you're going to have governance units, which are usually going to be formal government agencies and people like that. So that's going to be that 3rd part. So that would be step 2 in those 3 parts. And after all 3 of these are there, then you have a complete step 2. So going into step 3, external organizations are brought in. So this one kind of is when resources and funding and aid are going to bring in. So external people are going to bring in, or organizations are going to bring in resources such as funding, legal aid, food, water, that kind of stuff into the to help solve the problem. And this also brings about this idea of external actors, and those are people who are going to be outside in the environment, outside of the dominant and the challenger organizations, that are not immediately recognized. So they're not immediately obvious that they're part of this problem, trying to solve this problem. And they're not looking to be recognized either. So you can't usually tell who they are. So it goes into step 4, which is power between dominants and challenger groups establishes if the problem is worthwhile. So if there's a power struggle between the dominant and challenger groups, then there's probably a problem that's worthwhile and worth mentioning and looking into. And this brings about the idea of primary and secondary logistics. For this, primary was going to refer to legitimate actions of the dominant organization. So anything that the dominant organizations are doing that are legitimate and stuff we've talked about before are going to be primary, while a secondary action, logistic action, would refer to anything that challengers have been doing. So those groups that are opposing dominant organizations. So we're going to go into the 5th element, which is there's going to be some kind of event that occurs and causes those challengers to try to stabilize the environment, which means that they're going to want to stabilize the field, and if they don't stabilize it, it could mean that other challengers are going to enter it and become dominant or change teams and stuff like that. So they want to stabilize the environment and only let certain people in. So that would move us into the 6th part of this. This one's got a couple sub-parts to it. So So as new actors and innovative action are produced between dominant and challenger groups. So there's usually 3 types of mobilizing mechanisms that's going to cause people to start producing innovative action. New actors in this case is other organizations who are coming in, but innovative action is going to be created by mobilizing mechanisms, and there's going to be 3. So the first one is that perception that a challenger organization can pose threats. So or opportunities. So other organizations are going to perceive that the challenger organization can threaten them or give them opportunities. And then it could lead to social appropriation, which is when one organization takes the perspective from another and becomes the main one, so the power is diverted. So it could be like a challenger becoming a dominant in this case. And then for the last one, if more than one try to be that dominance, it could lead to even more change, which could lead to innovative actions we were talking about in this framework. And then the last is going to be your outcome. And they achieve some kind of stability. And once the stability is achieved, the movement decides, okay, we're going to have a new problem to face, or a new outcome, or we want a different outcome. So that would be the next step. And that would be all 7 of that 7-step framework. And like I said, I'm not going to expect you to know the ins and outs of this framework and setup. So if you just know the names of the steps and stuff like that, that should be all you need for the exam, especially for the final. I don't think I'm going to ask you to apply this in any way, shape, or form. I don't even think I could think of an example at the moment that would apply this completely. But I still wanted to cover it. So just knowing the steps is fine for this one, for this framework. But I would know the constructionist one a little bit better. So now that we've talked about the McAdams framework, which is a 7-step, and along with the constructionist one, we're going to start talking about political opportunity structures. And this is recognized by Campbell in 2005. And basically what social opportunity structures are those social or political conditions that make movements go a certain direction. So like the climate, like the political climate can influence them to go one direction or the other. If we were to use current events as an example, the climate right now, especially with our current president, has been very, let's see what the word is, conservative and stuff like that, in terms of the political climate and stuff like that. And everybody's kind of at odds with each other. So it probably influenced a social movement like Black Lives Matter once George Floyd was murdered. It probably influenced them to turn to the rioting and the damaging and all that violence, when we could have gone a different direction, or we could have stayed in the same direction. So that's kind of like an example. It's not the best example because it's still currently happening, and I'm not trying to impose any beliefs or anything, but I'm trying to give you an example that to think about for later when you're trying to remember what these are. It's kind of like a political climate that makes you more likely to happen a certain way versus a different way. So that's what political opportunity structure is going to be. So all of this thus far that we've been talking about has been like examples of resentment groups. So if you look back at Merton's modes of adaptation, we're talking about the resentment category here. So everything thus far has been talking about them. And then we're also going to talk about rebellious organizations in a minute, but we're going to start with and wrap up resentment first. So the book provides this as an example. And like I said, when I was making this, prepping these lectures and stuff like this, it was very interesting because it was literally done. I was literally working on the lectures when I found out about all the rioting and everything. So, and if you read the chapters as expected, they talk about Black Lives Matter, but because this book didn't this book was like published in 2016, I think. So it definitely doesn't include what just happened or anything that's happened since 2016. So they talk about it as being an example of a resentment group, but one could argue that it is could have been moved to another category based on what has been happening. Because like I said, this is not current. Definitely doesn't include anything that just happened. So it's definitely going to be one of those resentment groups. And we all know how good of an example that is right now. So we're next going to talk about, like I said, everything else has been our resentment groups. So now we're going to talk about like rebellious ones who are wanting to completely overhaul things. So like we talked about with Merton's theory, rebellious groups want to replace socially acceptable goals and create new ones. Replace it and create new ones. And then they want to look for unconventional means to achieve those. So they're completely opposite of what a conventional one would be. And it's important to note here that not all of these rebellious organizations necessarily are going to resort to violence to solve something. They could just be, you can see with our examples later, they could just be specific religious cults or groups, religious affiliations. Like we talk about Mormons and Latter-day Saints in a little bit as an example of how they're like their views are a little bit different than ours, so they tend to be, and their goals are different than ours. So it would be a good example here. So, but they're not using violence to get their means. They're just an example of of a rebellious group who has different goals, different means of achieving them. So then we're going to talk about resource mobilization theory, and this was created by Grouch. Hope I'm saying that right, but it looks like Grouch, so it's going to be Grouch. And he used this theory to examine oppositional consciousness and collective identity. So we're going to talk about a little bit about what those are. Like I said, if you've taken any sociology classes, you've probably talked about these two ideas before. So a collective identity is having awareness, feelings, or characteristics that are similar to others. So you're grouping, and you know certain people are a part of that group. So you're basing it like, say, trying to think of a good example. You are looking, like when you came to college, you're looking for, or let's go back to high school. And you really like to play chess, for an example. So you want to be part of the chess club. So your collective identity would be finding people or groups of people who are similar to you who also like to play chess. So that would be the chess club. And that is a collective identity. Being part of the chess club would be an example. And that's a really weird example, I know. But it's the first thing I thought of. So, but it could be anywhere. But having that awareness and finding people who are very similar to you as a group would be a collective identity. So, continuing on with this idea, talking about oppositional consciousness, and that is the idea and beliefs that are developed by oppressed groups. And then these oppressed groups are going to use those ideas and beliefs to revolt. So, it's having these ideas that are oppressed and sometimes oppositional to what socially acceptable ones. That would be oppositional consciousness. So Grouch also suggested here that the group's ability to secure needed resources was more important than breaking down society. So groups are going to focus more so on having the resources to survive than they are to make everybody act a certain way and join their club or their society or their goals, subscribe to their goals or whatever. So the book also talked about utopians and terrorists as an example of social movements. So during the late 20th century, so 1990s, or not 1990s, like 60s and 70s, there was a lot of groups for a lot of revolutionary groups of people who came about. This included criminal means. They could use criminal. They could have just had different goals and means to achieve them. It could be anything. But the book argued that utopians and terrorists were examples of this. So this also brought towards the idea of the counterculture. You might have heard this, like I said, in sociology, if you ever taken anything in that discipline and how they're connected. It was coined by Roszak in 1969, and it refers to periods of time where people rejected dominant, socially acceptable goals and means to achieve them. And I say sounds familiar here because it is, this definition that I gave should sound familiar because it's something alike to Merton's theory. So like I said, Merton's theory has been applied a lot here, and we're still talking about it. So that's what a counterculture is. And I have some counterculture examples. So there, like I said, there were a bunch during the 1960s and 70s. If you think about marijuana, with the hippies and the flower power and all that, that kind of culture with the stoners and everybody, like in that kind of group during the 60s and 70s, think about like when marijuana was criminalized and then decriminalized. So with other drugs, do it too. Here I also mentioned cults and societies. So like I said earlier with Mormons, we're an example where they're not necessarily doing anything criminal, but they have views that are different than the socially acceptable ones. So they're a counterculture, for example. Same with, you could argue probably like Amish would be an example here too of a counterculture. There's been some cults that could be examples. I know the book mentions Jonestown. I just recently watched Waco, and I would argue that the main guy, lost my train of thought in his name, but his group, David, the Davidians, is an example here as well of a counterculture. Well, not exactly a counterculture, but close to it and stuff like that. So those are some of the examples that I tried to come up with that would be examples to illustrate my point. So that's pretty much it for this chapter in this lesson. Like I said, this is incredibly relevant.
I don't know what you mean by
my watch. But it's incredibly relevant currently. So this was a kind of an interesting chapter and lessons to prepare. So, like I said, we're going to do a quick recap. So we talked about the idea of collective behavior, and that's when people are going to behave in similar situations. They're going to group together, and they're going to be motivated to explore solutions to strain. We talked about social problems and the social constructionist process, which was fourfold. And the example with the wealth. Wealth was that example for this one. When we talked about welfare, and that not being good enough for them, so they changed, or they trying to advocate for a different solution to their process. And then we talked about the critiques of that social constructionist framework. We talked about how groups of people organizing themselves to fight for a solution, and said how there's only a little bit of attention paid, and not enough attention was paid towards it. So not enough focused on organizations, how they're structuring themselves to do this. So that led to the McAdam and Scott framework, which was sevenfold. So we went through the 7 steps of that, and like I said, there was a helpful table on page 195 that you can go back to look at in order to see this. We also talked about political opportunity structures, and we talked about how the political climate is right now, and how that might influence movements to be more violent or go a certain direction, which is really an example right now with current events. And we used our resentment group, where the book, like I said, it was from 2016. So this could be changing as we speak. We could be watching it change as we're taking the class. So that was this group. And then we went into rebellious organizations and talking about how not all of them are going to resort to violence to get to their to the end goal. And we also talked about resource mobilization theory with Grouch, with collective identity and oppositional consciousness. And we finished off this chapter today and stuff like that with counterculture, which was coined by Roszak in 1969. So that's pretty much it for this lecture. We're going to start with our next one. The next one was going to be on criminal organizations, so it's going to be a little bit more interesting, hopefully, as well. It's a shorter lecture, so you have to worry about listening to me for 30 minutes, and my animals deciding to wreak havoc in the middle of my recordings. So, that being said, we'll have our next lecture soon. Alright, everybody stay safe and stay sane. We're almost to the end of this, so here's to that.